Hello and welcome to this episode of Positively Negative. So today I'm going to talk about exposure and how to expose manually. So take your camera off auto mode and let's talk about how to get exactly the exposure, exactly the image that you want every single time. Before we get to apertures and shutter speeds and ISO values, first we need to talk about stops. So a stop is an amount of light. It doesn't matter exactly what that amount is, it's this much. It's the amount of light you can hold in your hand. Imagine it's an arbitrary amount of light, okay? The important thing is what happens when you add a stop of light. When you add a stop of light, you are doubling the amount of light hitting the sensor or film plane. So one extra stop of light means that the amount of light entering the lens and hitting the film is doubled, okay? So 2 stops over means double and double again. So it's actually 4 times the amount of light. 3 stops over is double that again, so it's 8 times the amount of light. Let's start with probably the easiest one to understand, ISO. So an ISO value is a number that corresponds to the sensitivity to light of either a film stock or a digital camera sensor. ISO values are given in numbers that double, so starting normally at about 50 to 100 to 200, 400, 800, 1600 and 3200 and on and on and on. Going up 1 stop, so doubling the amount of light, means doubling the ISO value. So doubling the ISO value doubles the amount of light and adds 1 stop of light to the exposure. Now ISO values come from the days of film photography, because different film stocks had different sensitivities to light. Film stocks that have a low sensitivity to light are referred to as slow film stocks. Example of a slow film stock would be Ilford Pan F, which is an ISO 50 film. It needs a lot of light to create a perfectly exposed image. On the other end of the spectrum, Ilford Delta 3200 is referred to as a fast film because it needs much less light to create a properly exposed image, right? So if you hear of fast film or slow film, that just refers to the ISO value of the film. Medium speed films are your ISOs between 100 and 400. Those are your sort of day-to-day film stocks. Now that carries over to the world of digital, of course, but with digital you can adjust your ISO as you're shooting. Where film stocks have one ISO that you have to stick to throughout your entire roll, a digital camera, you can change the ISO value every photograph you take. Now, when you're talking about film photography, a high ISO translates to a grainier image. That's the rule of thumb, okay? Ilford Delta 3200 is a much grainier film than Ilford Pan F, the slow film, right? The 50 ISO film. That low ISO value film, Ilford Pan F50, is a higher resolution, sharper film that will give you far less grain. Ilford Delta 3200, 3200 ISO film, it's a high ISO film, it is sensitive to light, you can shoot it in low light conditions, but you're going to get more grain. Digital cameras, exactly the same, except now we're not talking about film grain, we're talking about digital noise. For example, the camera I'm shooting this video with, a Canon 200D, I really don't want to be shooting above an ISO of about 1600, 1600 before I start getting digital noise. Now where film grain might be an appealing aesthetic, it might be something you're after, digital noise just looks crap, it just looks ugly. And so we want to avoid that at all costs. More expensive digital cameras can shoot at higher ISOs and produce less digital noise, and that's why they cost money. So now let's talk about shutter speeds. The shutter speed refers to the amount of time that the shutter in the camera's lens or in the camera body remains open to expose the film plane or the sensor to light. So in other words, a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second means that the shutter is open for 1/60th of a second. For 1/60th of a second, it is exposing the film or the digital sensor to light. So how do you use shutter speed in your photography? Well, think about it this way. If your shutter is open for a long time, say a second, and your subject is moving, right? If the shutter is open for the entire second, it is going to be capturing all of that movement in the form of motion blur. right? So you'll be getting a blurry image. A blurry, you might even see it in my fingers as I'm moving here. This is that sort of motion blur that exists. This is because the camera is at 1/50th of a second shutter speed, so I'm getting this blurriness. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't want that. So the faster your shutter speed, the more the camera is able to freeze action. If a stop means halving or doubling the amount of light hitting film or hitting a sensor, then by rights a stop in shutter speed values is halving or doubling the amount of time that the shutter is open. If you go from 1/25th of a second to 1/50th of a second, you have reduced your exposure by one stop because you've increased the shutter speed, so you've decreased the amount of time that the shutter is open to allow light in to expose the film or digital sensor. Alright, so now we've got ISO, the sensitivity to light. Now we have shutter speed, the amount of time that the shutter is open to allow light to hit the sensor. So all that's left now is the size of the hole, the size of the aperture. So if you think about it this way, if the hole that lets light in is big, it's going to be letting in more light than if the hole was small, right? It's like if you're at home and you open your curtains. If you open your curtains a sliver, the room is still going to be dark. But if you open your curtains wide and let the sun in, the room's light, right? You've increased the amount of light coming in. And that's what aperture is. Aperture refers to the size of the hole in the lens that's allowing light in. Okay? It's as simple as that. Where people get confused with aperture is because they give it funny numbers called f-stops. So here I've got an old Pentax lens. It's an f2.8 lens. Okay, you'll know exactly what that means shortly. f2.8 lens, it is a 105 millimeter f2.8 lens. Okay, it's a lovely portrait lens. Watch what happens when I adjust the aperture ring on this lens. I'm going to bring it right up to the camera so that you can see right through it. Do you see that the lens is wide open? You can see my fingers moving here in the background. If I turn the aperture ring to the left or right and I stop the lens down, as they say, can you see that the aperture ring has gotten smaller? The hole has gotten smaller, right? I'll open it up again. It's wide open now. You can see right through the lens. And if we close the aperture down, that amount of light coming in is much smaller. Okay. So the f-stops are a very specific set of numbers that are the same wherever you go. And moving from one f-stop to the next increases the amount of light hitting the film or the sensor by one stop. So it doubles the amount of light. Okay. So now if I look at this lens, this is an f2.8 lens, which means that its maximum aperture is f2.8. If I show you on this lens, these old lenses are great because you can actually see on the lens itself exactly the numbers for the aperture values. Vintage and classic lenses are great because they show you the f-stop values in one-stop increments. Okay, so if you can memorize all the numbers on one of these old classic vintage lenses, you know all the important f-stop numbers. So if I start this lens at f2.8, and I stop it down, I close the aperture by one stop, I close it down to f4. That's reducing the amount of light hitting the film or the digital sensor by one stop, halving it. So memorize those f-stop numbers, I'll put them up on the screen. Memorize them, they're the same everywhere, always are. Where it gets a little bit more confusing is that digital cameras, modern ones, measure f-stops in 1/3 stop increments. But if you know the full stop increments by heart, you'll be able to figure out the third stop increments pretty quickly and understand what they mean. Oh, it's just gotten dark. We've just lost a stop of light, I think. So I might have to adjust the camera. Otherwise, I'll just leave it and you can see how it changes throughout this video. So now the question is, besides the amount of light hitting the film or the digital sensor, what does f-stop actually do? What does the aperture actually do to the image? Well, aperture controls depth of field. Now, depth of field refers to the distance at which things are reasonably in focus in a photograph. Okay? So if you're doing a landscape photograph and you want everything in focus from right in front of the camera to infinity to the horizon, you need a very deep depth of field. You need a completely deep depth of field, an infinite focus depth of field. Okay? If you're doing a portrait where you want your subject, like me, to be in focus and the background to be slightly out of focus, as it is here, you need a shallower depth of field. Do you see how it's shallow? Because the distance between what's in focus and what's out of focus is not large. It's quite small. Okay, so we talk about a shallow depth of field. Now, here's where it gets a little bit confusing. Large apertures equal small numbers equals small depth of field. f2.8, this lens wide open, you can see it's wide open. Letting in a lot of light translates to a shallow depth of field. So if I shoot a photograph with this lens at f2.8, my subject will be in focus, hopefully, and the background will be out of focus, depending on whether or not I nail focus when I take the photograph. Now, if I stop this lens down to f16, the background would be in focus as well, or at least more in focus than it would be at f2.8. A fast aperture, what we refer to as a fast lens, a lens that allows in a lot of light, an f1.8 or an f2 or an f2.8 lens, allows in a lot of light, but reduces the depth of field in a photograph. Although it's not necessarily part of getting your exposure correct, I think it's important to talk about a lens's focal length as well in regards to depth of field. In general, a longer lens, a lens with a longer focal length, we'll talk about this in another video at some stage, like my 105mm lens, will give you a shallower depth of field than a wide-angle lens. You might even see this with your cell phone. Your cell phone camera's got a wide-angle lens, you'll see that everything is in focus generally. That's why you have to create artificial background blur after the fact, because the wide-angle lens is incapable of giving you that background blur that you're looking for. So now the question is, how do you remember all of these things? The truth is you pick them up very quickly. The more you use them, the quicker you get used to them. I would say if you're shooting with a modern digital camera, that camera is going to have an aperture priority mode. All right? Now what that means is that the photographer, you make the decision as to what aperture the camera is going to take the picture at. Okay? So if you tell the camera, I want f8 in this photograph because I want a depth of field where I can get most things in focus, the camera will then look at the light available and decide what ISO and what shutter speed to use. Okay? Now, when you use aperture priority, take note of what shutter speed and what ISO value the camera is selecting for you. And very quickly you'll start to see a correlation between the three of them. Think about it. If you want to shoot a landscape and you want everything in focus, right? You want everything in focus. So you know that you're going to have to shoot that landscape at f22. The lens stop down, the hole very small. Logically, it follows then that you're going to need more light to hit the sensor or to hit the film plane. Okay? So now what does that mean? You've already selected your aperture. So now you've only got two other things that you can adjust. You can adjust your ISO, your sensitivity to light, or you can adjust your shutter speed. Now, if you're doing a landscape on a slightly breezy day and the trees are moving in the wind, that means that you don't necessarily want to use a slow shutter speed because you're going to capture all of that movement, all those trees moving. So now you know you need f22. You also know that you need a reasonably fast shutter speed to freeze the action, say 1/125th of a second. All that's left then to do is to adjust the ISO. If you want to take a portrait of somebody and you want to have a shallow depth of field, then you already know that you want your lens to be stopped to about f2 or f2.8 or maybe even f1.4 if you want extreme shallow depth of field, right? Which is what people often want when they do portraits. So now you've already decided on your aperture value range. You know what apertures you want because you know what image you want. You've already seen it in your mind. So now all you have to do is adjust your shutter speed and ISO value accordingly to get a correct exposure. Alright guys, so that's really all I want to get into with this video. I know it's gotten a bit long and I know it might seem complicated, but the more you practice with these things, the more you use them, and I would even go so far as to say the more you use older manual lenses and cameras where you have to do everything yourself and everything is measured in one-stop increments, the better you'll get at these things. But even if at the very least after watching this video you feel less terrified about manual exposure, then I'm happy. It's really not rocket science. If I can do it, you can do it. Anyway, thanks guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.